When we're out field recording to gather sounds for different projects, we want to have a think about whether we want to record in mono or stereo. So this is a big call, and it depends on the sort of material that we're trying to gather. So for a lot of sound effects type things, so impact things or things where we say opening a door, etc., where it happens in one particular space or spot, either if it's for video production in the screen or when we're placing it into a mix where it's happening in one particular place in time in the panoramic space, if we're dealing with stereo or beyond, then mono is often the go. It is a really common and straightforward and simple option, and it covers most of our needs when it comes to those individual spot effect type things. If we're recording music, etc., then a lot of things are just recorded mono as well. So, we're recording a guitar amp. Typically just a single microphone will do, or maybe you'll have a couple that you blend it, but typically it's just occupying one point in space, and then we add spatialization if we want to in post-production in the mix, so either through panning, adding things like reverb and delay, etc., to add some other spatial element to it. So nothing wrong with going out with a single mono microphone to gather effects, a very common option that might be the go. So in terms of mics that I've got plugged in at the moment, I've only got my little lav. And so just to clarify, so this is mono. My soundtrack of my video is stereo. So I can pan myself as I talk, so panning off to the left now, and then panning off to the right. If we're dealing with dialogue, then we don't tend to pan, we tend to leave it in the center, if it's dialogue for a screen production, for instance. But all of this is a matter of taste, and it depends on the project. But as a normal rule, dialogue is center for screen productions. Okay, so that's all fine and good. So that's mono, pretty hopefully straightforward. Mono just means one. And then we move on to stereo. So if we do want to record in stereo, what sort of things are worth recording in stereo? So if we're recording stereo, we need at least 2 microphones or capsules. And what I've got here is an example of a setup where this is considered an XY configuration. And so this is what's called a coincident type of stereo configuration. Coincident just means that the mic capsules are placed coincident or next to each other, very close to each other. And the idea of that is that by placing them close to each other, we are avoiding any time differences or minimising time differences. Let's say we're avoiding them altogether ideally, of the time that the sound reaches each of these microphones. By avoiding time differences, that means we avoid phase issues or phase differences. By avoiding phase issues or timing issues, that means that when we combine these microphones into mono, which we often might want to do, or often our products need to be made sure that our mixes are mono compatible down the line. So for instance, if we're broadcasting, you don't know what device that people are listening out of. They might be just listening out of a device with a mono speaker. And if that's the case, then we need to make sure that they can still hear everything, that we don't get cancellation when we combine these things. So that's an XY configuration. It's comprised of 2 directional microphones. In this case, these are hypercardioid, but cardioid is actually more common. And it ranges typically from 90 to 120 degrees. If we want a little bit of time difference between our mic capsules, so the minus of that, or the con of that, I guess, is that we have this time or phase difference, which can lead to some phase interference when they combine, which can make it less mono-compatible. However, as we start to move our capsules apart, so now we're looking at an ORTF setup, and the capsules are around 17 centimetres apart, and the idea is that they're about ear width apart. And so what the pluses and minuses of that is that now that we have time differences between our 2 microphone capsules, much like our ears have time differences between them, we get this timing difference, and that contributes to that sense of stereo spread or width. And for more sounds that are meant to be more spacious, like for instance atmospheres, this can be really nice and really pleasant. I actually much prefer this sort of configuration and a non-coincident stereo microphone configuration for atmospheres and things that are meant to be a little bit more spacious. Whereas if things are meant to be very tight and we need some really serious mono compatibility, then maybe XY is better for some of those things. So ORTF, 110 degrees and 17 centimeters apart is your normal setup for cardioid. And then that can vary a little bit depending on the polar response of your microphones, if you want to try other configurations, but that's sort of the norm. So let's give this one a go. I've got a microphone stand here so that we can have a listen to it. I'm outside. I really need wind protection for these mics because they are very sensitive to wind noise, these ones. They have a really good low frequency response pickup, but also extremely sensitive to wind noise. So I'll pop on my wind protection. It's not really blowing a gale, so I think I can probably just get away with this much wind protection rather than going for the full furry option. So we'll give this a chance. I'll just do this up so it's sitting properly. And we'll have a little bit of a listen to this now that I've got it set up. Okay, so that's it there, and I'm now not listening to the lav, we're listening to the microphone. So I'm not quite centered on visually, but you can hear what's going on there in terms of the space. And I'll crank it up a little bit just so we can hear the general atmosphere of the background. It's a fairly quiet rural location. There's a building with some aircon on not far away, or heating on. Reverse cycle heating, and then otherwise there's some birds and some other rural sounds. So I'll just be quiet for a moment and crank that. Now we are getting a little bit of wind noise. It's very low, but what I can do is just switch my high pass filter on, and I'll just switch it on at like 80. And that's just reduced that. So it's pretty subtle anyway in terms of what you're hearing, so nothing too exciting to report. So I think that'll do for RTF, and I'll come back with some other mic configuration in a moment. The next mic configuration that we're going to talk about is mid-side. Now mid-side, this just looks like a normal regular shotgun microphone from first appearances, but actually it's got two microphone capsules in it, this one. It's got a mid, which is our forward-facing shotgun. It's also got a side, which is a bidirectional. So if I hold it up that way, the bidirectional is capturing out from the sides in that direction. Now, this is an interesting configuration, been in use for a lot of years. It is coincident, so the mic capsules are right next to each other. So good mono compatibility, in fact, fantastic mono compatibility the way that this works. The advantage of this one is that you can modify your stereo width in post-production, depending on how you record it, if you record it as your raw tracks. So let's have a look at how that works. And I'll just, so this is actually, it's got a 5-pin XLR, you can see, because we've got our 2 channels of microphone going out. So we need a ground and a hot and a cold for each of our 2 signals. So I'll just get wind protection on because it's not going to really go very well out here without some kind of wind protection. So we'll get that on, and I should get away with the basic wind protection for this, although in saying that I might need to put on my furry windshield because this is not in the best shape, this windshield. Let's see how we go. I think that might work fine. So just doing up this is my blimp, a road blimp in this case for this one. Okay, so I've got some wind protection, so I'm going to turn my lav down, which is what we're listening to at the moment, and then turn up the shotgun mic. Okay, check 1, 2, check 1, 2. Okay, so this is our shotgun microphone. We've got the mid-side, and it is actually, I've set it up on mid-side linking for these 2 channels, so we should have some stereo action, some pickup around the side, even though it sounds a little bit duller at the moment. Now what can happen is that I can modify the amount of the side signal by upping my recording level in the side. And that actually has the effect of, in this case, upping the amount of side in that stereo mix, which makes it more stereo or wider. If you push it too far, things can start to sound really weird, and it might not really be. I'm not sure if we can tell on my voice because it's basically just mono source, but if it is a little bit dangerous that pushing too much of the side into this. So we'll see how that goes. It's really, really wonderful for that flexibility, but I don't, because it's non-coincident, or because it is coincident, sorry, it doesn't have any time differences between our capsules, so it doesn't have that sense of spaciousness. So I really like this for capturing spot effects because I've got a really solid center and I can add some width to it if I want to, which is, I think, really great and add some flexibility. But I don't love it for ambiances because it doesn't really have that sense of spread that I like in the same way, and as well as it's got some differences in terms of the non-coincident versus the coincident, so how that works. And there's some yellow-tailed black cockatoos over there which I might just try and capture for you. Beautiful looking creatures, not necessarily beautiful sounding. All right, so this weird looking thing is a dummy head, and we're just going to talk about binaural dummy head recording. So if I grab this one and we look a little bit closer, you see that there's actually a microphone capsule placed in the ear. Now this is a homemade job that I've made, just using a dummy head and drilling a space for the holes. These microphones are DPA 4060s, which are little omnidirectional microphones. So this is not a true Schmico binaural dummy head. You can get some really great ones. So the one from Neumann cost you probably the best part of 10 grand, has a more correct head in terms of size and shape. The shape of it's actually a little bit blocky, but the general size of it is more anatomically accurate. The ears are particularly accurate. These are not actually, these are a little bit, like they've got a bit of a pinner shape, but they're certainly not accurate to real people's ears. Those things will all make a difference to how these sound. So what we're relying on in terms of stereo sound generally is either time or phase differences or level differences that we get between the two microphones. In this case, we've got a little bit of both. So we've got a time difference getting from one ear to the other. We've got level differences because this is reaching this side, but we've got this acoustic shadow coming from so if we have a sound over this side, it reaches this ear directly, but it's actually getting this blocking. So both blocking in terms of frequency response and also in terms of level that we have over here. And so we have this thing called the interaural time differences and interaural phase differences that we get. And so yeah, that's how it generally works. Now, this works really great for recordings where people listen back on headphones. It sounds wonderful. It sounds natural. Not as effective on speakers, but can still be pretty good. So certainly don't write it off. Now, because we're outside, I'm actually going to put some wind protection on, which hopefully I can make this sit okay. It's made for a little bit bigger, but there we go. So now I've got some wind protection, and then now let's have a listen to our binaural here. So nice little bird recording there that I just happened to capture. So always be ready to be quiet if you're field recording in case there's good opportunities for cool sounds. My stomach grumbled a tiny bit in there. I don't know if it's going to be audible, but that's another thing to be mindful of. Don't be too close to the microphones if you're trying to capture stuff. try not to breathe on the microphones or too loudly close to microphones, and also make sure you've eaten so that your stomach's not grumbling away. Anyway, here's my binaural example. So over to what should be the right ear and back around the head and over to the left ear. And if I kind of walk around, you can see how that goes, and you can have a listen on your headphones. And I'm talking from above now as well. And so see how that sounds. Now, binaural is really effective for ASMR type sounds. So, hey, can you hear me whispering in your ear? How does that feel or sound? A little bit strange. This can be really disgusting for some people, and other people really like it. Anyway, here we go. That's it. Thanks. Now, there's some of the most common stereo microphone techniques that you'll come across. There are a few others that are worth mentioning. So AB stereo or space stereo is just where we have two microphones and they're facing in the same direction, but they are spaced apart. This can work for either omnidirectional microphones. So omnidirectional, it shouldn't really matter which way they're facing, or directional microphones, in which case it obviously will matter which way they're facing. So in terms of distancing, we're generally talking at least 10 centimetres apart. So ORTF is 17 centimetres apart. And so generally I'd suggest a minimum of that head sort of space. AB30 is a common one, so 30 centimetres. This is getting a little bit wide for probably on the screen, so about 30 centimetres. That's quite a common one. Generally between, I'd say, 30 and 60 centimetres is the most common range that people will use depending on the amount of space. And that spacing will have an effect on how mono-compatible it is. So there is more cancellation with these sorts of wider spacing techniques or non-coincident techniques. So there are more mono-compatibility issues that we might have because of those phase issues. But it does have this sense of spaciousness and width. If you go really wide, you can have what's called a hole in the middle effect, where it doesn't sound like there's a cohesive sound field. It sounds like there's a bit of a dip, and they're just two totally non-coherent or microphones or channels that we've got going on. So that's a really good one to mention. A variation on that is like our dummy head of the Jecklin disc, where we have some kind of barrier in the middle. And there's some variations around that as well. Optimized stereo signal, the OSS, and some things like that. So experiment, have a listen to different options if you get the opportunity to try different stereo techniques, because they all have their pros and cons, and it depends on what you're recording.